In this online lecture, we're going to be looking at some examples of Hindu art and architecture. Now, I will be referring here to Hinduism as a religion, but I do want to acknowledge that in actuality, it may be more accurate to refer to Hinduism as a philosophy or a way of life. And I'll explain why by looking at some aspects of Hinduism that set it apart from some of the other religions that we've studied in this class. So, first of all, with Hinduism, there's no historical founder like we see with Christianity's Jesus or Islam's Muhammad or Buddhism's Siddhartha Gautama. Second, there's no text per se, at least not a single text that lays out the beliefs, the practices, the myths, the expectations of the religion, something similar to like a Bible or a Quran. Now, this is not to say that there are no texts associated with Hinduism. There are. For example, you have the Vedas, which is in Sanskrit, it means to know. These are the Vedas, the belief of Hinduism's oldest and most sacred texts. And they date anywhere between 1800 to 1200 BCE. And what they do is they not only invoke the gods and detail ritual practice, but they also function to serve as a sort of handbook for priests. And they include a number of hymns for recitation as well. Now, the production of the Vedas do not mark the beginning or the birth of Hinduism. Hinduism and its roots extend far back beyond the writing of these texts. Now, as to when Hinduism began, this is something that it seems scholars are not quite sure about. And I say this because I've read differing dates. I've read some people who say 1500, other people say 4000. I've even read as old as 10,000 BCE. And these dates would make Hinduism easily the longest surviving organized, institutionalized religion in human history. Now, there's a reason why there's no single text that prescribes how exactly to practice Hinduism. And this is why this belief system really is better described as a philosophy or a way of life. Because there's no one set way to practice Hinduism. There is this really wonderful individual applicability to the belief system. And it makes it highly personal and therefore highly variable. For example, there's no specific day that Hindus worship, like how Christians worship on Sunday or Muslims worship on Fridays. So no specific date, no specific place, like how Christians go to a church or Muslims go to a mosque. So no specific place. And really, there's no specific set of behaviors that one must conform to. Now, despite all of this variability, there is one link that binds Hindus, and that is found in their rituals. There is common structure to the way that those rituals are practiced. Now, I'm going to stop here for now. We're going to cover more details of the Hindu belief system, but I want to show you some art that'll help to illustrate these points. So we're going to start with Elephanta, and it's at Elephanta that we have one of the best examples of a cave temple in Hindu architecture. Now, I want to clarify first that these are not natural caves per se, but rather they were constructed as spaces that were carved out of the mountainsides. And you can kind of see that here. So this is an example of rock cutting, and the earliest rock cutting in this manner began around the year 260 BCE. It was first practiced by the Buddhists in India, and then it was followed by the Hindus approximately 600 years later. As to why we're seeing temples replicating caves, this is something we can understand if we think back to earlier in the semester. We know that caves can represent significant spiritual places. We saw this with some of the earliest art made by man, the cave paintings from the Paleolithic period. Caves can operate as portals an entryway into another spiritual plane. And by the way, you can see that just by looking at this photograph. This like entry into the abyss is what it seems like. And this is because, again, as you can see, they're dark, they're silent, they're hidden away, and they can create the type of atmosphere that really is conducive to spiritual transcendence. The cave temple is a reflection of Hindu tendency to pay homage to natural landscapes. So they're not just making cave temples, but they make temples that are evocative of mountains or nearby streams or have a relationship to trees, etc. Now, the sheer size of this particular cave temple, combined with the fine craftsmanship and sophisticated artistry of the sculpture within, suggests that this cave was made possible by royal patronage. So perhaps Krishnaraja I from the Kalachuri dynasty, who was a devout worshiper of the god Shiva. That's who we're thinking made it, or was the patron. And I'll explain a little bit more about this in the next slide. So one of the superstars within Cave 1 at Elephanta is this large sculpture that we see here. It's a giant rock-cut sculpture of Shiva, flanked on either side by a guardian figure, which those guardian figures denote the significance of the sculpture and what it represents. And what it represents is the multiplicity inherent within Hindu deities. So far in this class, we've been talking quite a bit about dualities or binaries, one or the other. For example, polytheistic or monotheistic, male or female, divine or human. These are all examples of either ors or binaries. For Hinduism, let's think about this word, both. Their religion was both polytheistic and monotheistic. The deities could embody both the masculine and the feminine at the same time. Your reading actually has a good term for this, henotheistic, and that is the belief in and the worship of the same God, one God, but it's also acknowledging that there is a possibility of other deities existing. So I'll just say that again. It's the belief of one God, worshiping that one God, but at the same time acknowledging the possibilities that there could be other gods. I think it's this really beautiful idea that God is unlimited, and therefore this supreme being can take on an endless variety of forms. Now for the Hindus, this supreme being is known as Brahman. So here we see the god Shiva in many forms, yet as one, and this is what the Maheshvara in the title is referring to. So we have multiple heads to refer to the many forms, yet the heads are unified onto this single torso. Now Shiva is known as both a creator and a destroyer at the same time. So again, we see that rejection of a duality to conceive of a religious figure as all-encompassing. The head facing the left, our left, is scary. It scowls, and it has flaming eyebrows and a snarling mouth. The headdress is made of snakes, and if you look down at the shoulder, you can see a fragment of a hand that was holding a snake. Now, the head facing to our right, this acknowledges Shiva's creative side and has a more feminine appearance with curly hair, a headdress adorned with pearls, and full pouty lips. This figure, if you look again down at the shoulder, is holding a lotus flower. Now let's talk about some iconography here. So snakes have had a long association with death and the underworld. So it's an appropriate symbol to connect to destruction. As for the lotus, consider how it grows. It typically grows in muddy, mucky swamps, and out of this grossness grows this beautiful blossom. Also, pearls typically have connections to fertility, so that's another relevant symbol that relates to creation. Now, the middle face, the one that stares out at us, is impassive and it's detached. He references kind of the middle ground between creation and destruction, and that would be preservation. This figure oversees and protects the universe that he creates and destroys, which enacts a cycle of existence known as samsara. Now, before we move on, there's just one little random point I want to make. It's something that I see a lot of students kind of misunderstanding. Even though Shiva has both feminine and masculine qualities, Shiva is understood as being conventionally male. For some reason, I come across a lot of people who think Shiva is female. I'm not really sure why. My only theory is maybe because the Shiva character from Mortal Kombat 3 was a female. She's got the multiple arms that we would expect to see of a Hindu deity. And of course, since it's a video game, she has to be this sexualized monster. Let's move on. Let's talk about the site of Mamallapuram, which it was and is an important destination for Hindu pilgrimage. Now, it's important to note here that pilgrimage is relatively common as part of the overall Hindu belief system. It's believed to be an act and a destination that facilitates spiritual transformation. Now, we can thank Mahendra Varman, the third ruler of the Pallavas dynasty, for this incredible site. It was his royal sponsorship that brought this very important Hindu site into being. Although there are some scholars who believe that the site can't be attributed to a single monarch, but was rather built over an extended time period between around the year 630 up to about 728. And this is an argument that's well supported by the variation of the sculptural and architectural styles that are found throughout the site. Now, we can see some of this variation here in the 2 of the 5 Raths that we see here. The word Rath means chariot, and the idea is that these are the vehicles of the gods. Now, moving forward, it's important to keep this context of royal patronage in mind. It's already come up twice now. It's going to be a theme both in this lecture, but it's also going to be a theme in your readings as well. Royal patronage is super important to consider because it was an important political tool. It demonstrated how powerful the rulers were, that they could command the creation of such extensive artworks. Further, it demonstrated how wealthy they were, which of course wealth functions to reinforce the power that they were attempting to convey. And it was a way to demonstrate this power within the wider tradition of rulership within India. If you could outdo your predecessor, that would say that you are far more powerful than anyone who has come before you. And that's what we kind of see is a lot of this royal patronage was a sort of this one-upmanship. So the first order of business here is to talk about the specifics of Southern Hindu architecture. This term Southern Hindu is both a geographic designation, we're talking about the south of India, and it's also a stylistic designation. Now, stylistically, what we see with Southern Hindu architecture are structures that are low and wide. Now, part of what creates this appearance of low and wide is the shikara, the tower that tops the shrine in the foreground of this photograph. You can see that the shikara has a stepped appearance, and that stepped appearance is created by horizontal divisions. Think of the qualities of a horizontal line. A horizontal line moves wide. This sends the viewer's eyes out to the side rather than up. Now, details, if you look, you can see that's like little mini buildings, little shrines on the shrine. And those mini shrines are called viharas. Another common feature of the Southern Hindu style is the stupika, which is the mushroom-shaped top that sits at the apex of the shikara. A stupika is a mini stupa. Also at Mamallapuram, and this is very typical of Hindu sites, is a shrine that houses a lingam. And a lingam is a non-iconic representation of Shiva. Now, we've talked about non-iconic art before with Islam and Buddhism. And what I really want to emphasize again is that the term means different things to different religions. So in Islamic religious art, okay, the religious art, their non-iconic means no depictions of people, no depictions of animals. For Buddhism, non-iconic means that people and animals are okay, but just not the Buddha in human form. At least not at first, right? But then eventually, once people kind of became more comfortable with it, Buddha did appear in human form in the Gandhara period. Now, for Hinduism, Shiva can appear in human form or in symbolic form, which is what we're seeing with the lingam. This symbol, the lingam, transcends the form of the human body. It's just a symbol. And therefore, because it transcends the body, it's intended to represent that all-encompassing Brahman, that supreme being. Also, it's a phallic symbol, and I think that matters. It's making a reference to an erect penis, which connects Shiva to the creation of life. Further symbolism. This phallic symbol, this lingam, this source of all life, is believed to be an axis mundi, which means it sits at the center of the universe. So Shiva is the source of creation at the very center of all existence. That's what this symbol is trying to say. Now, if you look to the right, you can see a lingam, a little baby one, and it's sitting on top of what's called a yoni, a word that translates to vulva, womb, or source. It's the feminine principle. So you've got the masculine sitting inside the feminine principle, right? This is sexy time, symbolic sexy time. Now, when these symbols appear together, we get this view of existence in totality, the masculine and feminine combined, the macro and microcosms combined. Often, this integration of these two symbols is interpreted as the divine union of Shiva and his consort Parvati. I chose this photograph also so that you can see how even today these symbols are worshipped. You see that they receive offerings of flowers, pigments, foods. There's a little slice of orange right there. It's a very beautiful and very simple reverence. Now, here we have an absolutely incredible relief sculpture that is located at the center of Mamallapuram. It's an example of Indian artistic talents when it comes to creating narrative work in an extensive and dense format. Now, as to what narrative we see here exactly, that is up for some debate. One possibility, and this is one that most scholars seem pretty into, is the tale of a king, Bhagiratha, who, in an attempt to purify the bones, or I've also read ashes, of his deceased ancestors, he puts himself through all sorts of torments. Now here, we can see in the red circles, this moment described here. He did things like look directly at the sun through his open fingers, or stand on one leg for extended periods of time. Now next to him, to his right, our left, there's Shiva, and you can get a sense, large in size, hierarchical scale, who's granting this penance by sending down to earth the Ganges River, which we can see represented in the cleft of the stone on the other side of this king. The Ganges River was one of the 3 sacred rivers of India, and out of this 3, the most sacred. Now, we can tell it's the Ganges River because if you look inside the cleft, you can see Nagarajas, snake deities, who dwell in the river waters. Here's what else. If we go back to the previous slide, you can see the wider spatial context of this sculpture. Look at the tip top. There actually is a natural reservoir that collects water at the top. When that water fills up, water actually flows down the cleft so that actual water stands in for the Ganges River. And if you look at the Nagaraja, the snake deities inside of the cleft, When the water moves over him, it makes the tails look like they're actually moving and swimming in the water. This is seriously a brilliant work of art. Now, to continue the story, Shiva brings down the Ganges River, and this not only purifies the ancestors' remains, but it also brings harmony and fertility to the earth. So, what we have then is this wider celebration of people and animals coming together to celebrate such a gift. So, that's one story. Another story is the penance of Arjuna, who was a member of the royal family of the Kuru kingdom. Same image, same figure in the red circle, but now we're saying that maybe it's Arjuna, who also is performing a penance, in this case, thanks for the blessings of Shiva. And this came in the form of one of Shiva's most powerful weapons, which I have circled in blue, that he gives to Arjuna to aid in successfully fighting the Mahabharata war. Now, what I think is interesting about this tale is that we have a political undertone here. This idea that there is a war that's being fought over royal succession, and Shiva's taking sides. When you think about how the site of Mamallapuram was commissioned by a king or a series of kings, you could see how this sort of messaging would be advantageous, that Shiva supports and gives blessings to kings. And if you would build the type of incredible pilgrimage site that Mamallapuram was, you surely would have the favor of the gods. Now, there's just one more thing I'd like to say in this matter. It's interesting to consider that our inability to tell which story is which in this case might be deliberate. Ambiguity was something that was really popular in Indian literature during this time. It was called Slesha, or the double meaning poem. And as the name suggests, the meaning really just depends on how the words are interpreted or the direction in which you take that interpretation. So what we may be seeing here is an artwork that is attempting to mirror the same stylistic aims of the literature of the time. Now, with this temple, we move on to an example of Northern Hindu architecture, which was a development that occurred later than the Southern style. Now, the differences are apparent if we do a little comparison. We can see that while the Southern style focuses on horizontality and width, the Northern style focuses on verticality. This is evident with the shikara, which is divided vertically, which moves the eye up rather than off to the side. So that's one difference. The sense of verticality is further emphasized with the fact that you see here in our northern example, multiple shikara of varying heights, which give the structure this organic appearance, as if it's growing from the ground. I also want to point out here that the multiple towers kind of are similar to a mountain range. So recall earlier in lecture, we noted that many Hindu temples we were attempting to replicate natural topography. Now, the other main difference that we're going to be focusing on between the southern and the northern approaches to the architecture is what topped the shikara. So we know for the southern structures that would be a stupika, a mini stupa. Now, for the northern structures, the shikara is topped by an amalaka, a fruit that was sacred to Shiva, as well as the gods Brahma and Vishnu, who were two other major deities in the Hindu pantheon. As to the iconographic symbolism of this fruit, there have been a few interpretations offered. That the shape also represents a person's cranium, so wisdom. It's a ribbed wheel, which the roundness would reflect a circle, and by extension, a cycle, which references samsara. And fruit in general has a very deep historical connection to fertility, which we know is a topic that appears frequently in Hindu art. One thing that we can see with this structure, the northern structure, and others built in the north during this time period, is an increasing complexity of the tower, of the shikara, in terms of ornamentation. Just take a close look at how detailed that is. And if you can't really tell, take a look at this. As we move in for a closer view, we can see that it's not just simply a pattern or a texture that covers the surface of these shikaras, but rather it's an insane amount of relief sculpture that depicts a wide range of celestial beings, a type of semi-divine figure, which we typically find on the outer areas of a temple. Now, if you take a look closely at what's going on, you can see there's different activities. And some of these activities include some pretty creative approaches to sexy time. Now, couples making love, this is frequent enough that we actually have a name for this image, Maithuna. Now, Maithuna motif isn't a new thing that we're only first seeing here. It does extend back into earlier examples of Hindu art, but the images appear in more discreet, private contexts. And as time passes, they became more popular, and then we start to see what we've got going on here, a more public and prominent display. Now, there's some explanations for this. It could be an influence coming from the Kama Sutra, that famous book we know all about because of all the sex positions. Now, I just want to say that that's a pretty superficial understanding of the Kama Sutra. There's so much more to this text than just sex. It actually was, as a whole, intended to be a guide to maintaining a sexual relationship, and the sex aspect was just a small part of it. Now, it might be surprising to see some pretty graphic representations of sex, at least according to Western standards and cultural norms, on the side of a religious structure. The two don't really seem like they go in hand, religious structure, sexy time. But look at it this way. It's a comment on being one with the gods, presented in some very literal terms that a viewer could understand. The closest you could possibly be with someone is that they are inside you, or you are inside of them. By showing this level of closeness, we can understand the potential regarding being close and intimate with the gods, and the sort of spiritual impact that would have on us. So really, these sculptures are presenting a goal for humble worshipers to aspire towards. Other scholars have suggested that the images of sex are repeated representations of the marital union between Shiva and his consort, which would be a kind of representational version of the lingam and yoni. Finally, there's another really interesting theory, and that is that the complexity of these sexual positions would be discrete geometric references. In this case, the geometric shapes implied through the way the bodies are arranged reference diagrams of the cosmos, and you'll understand further the significance when you read about Hindu temple design in your readings. Now, in this case, sex is a profound act that helps demystify some of the mysteries of the universe, and likely, I would say, man's relationship to these mysteries. Oh, this art is so good. I'm going to stop here for now, but don't you worry, because there's additional guide to Hindu art which you are going to read when you are in Canvas doing your reading assignments. So I hope you enjoy.